Não em declarações estrondosas, mas em pequenos sinais que apontam oportunidades. A ansiedade quando as contas se acumulam e as oportunidades parecem escassas. O medo de arriscar. A hesitação que custa mais do que qualquer investimento jamais custaria. Mas deixe-me compartilhar esta verdade. A verdadeira riqueza não nasce da sorte. Invisível no início, mas destinada a crescer, se nutrida com conhecimento, disciplina e coragem. Uma única decisão, uma escolha silenciosa, moldando a vida com a qual vocês sempre sonharam. A vida em que sua riqueza trabalha para você, e não o contrário. Obre empresas que perduram, empresas que geram valor real, ano após ano. Não apenas lucros passageiros, empresas construídas com base na confiança, desempenho e consistência. Eli dá um pequeno passo. Recitante, incerto e infesta. No começo, nada parece acontecer. Meses se transformam em anos, mas lentamente, quase imperceptivelmente, as sementes criam raízes. Até que, um dia, ele olha para trás e percebe. Cada decisão paciente, cada ação disciplinada, cada momento silencioso, de autocontrole, se transformou em liberdade. Em confiança, em propósito, amados ouvintes. Este é o poder de escolher as empresas certas para investir no Brasil em 2026. Não se trata apenas de retornos financeiros. Trata-se de construir uma vida de estabilidade, criar um legado e provar a si mesmo que disciplina e visão de longo prazo podem superar o medo. Deixe-me contar uma história rápida. Um jovem investidor começou com pouco. Ele comprou ações de uma empresa confiável, mesmo quando todos diziam que era arriscado. Ele manteve, mês após mês, sem pressa, sem medo. 10 anos depois, aquela decisão silenciosa transformou-se em liberdade financeira. Não apenas para ele, mas para sua família, para seus sonhos. Sobre entender quais empresas se alinham com seu propósito financeiro. Sobre escolher com consciência, investir com paciência e deixar o tempo fazer o seu trabalho. Porque no final, a riqueza não é corrida, é jornada. E cada passo que você dá hoje ecoa no seu amanhã. E agora, queridos ouvintes, chegamos à essência do que realmente transforma investimentos em liberdade. Não é apenas sobre escolher as empresas certas. É sobre quem você se torna no processo. Cada ação que você compra, cada decisão que você toma, reflete seu compromisso com a sua própria visão. and trade was flowing. Ships arrived on schedule. Caravans showed up dusty but full. Coins passed from hand to hand, worn smooth by time. Everyone understood value. Everyone understood exchange. The system worked well enough that most people stopped thinking about it, which is usually when systems feel strongest. Knowledge had its place too. Scholars studied stars, numbers, medicine, and old texts that were already ancient to them. Libraries stood quietly, filled with scrolls and tablets that held centuries of thought. People trusted that knowledge was being protected somewhere, even if they never went to see it themselves. That trust felt comforting. Religion and belief wrapped around everything. Temples stood tall, not just as places of worship, but as symbols. They reminded people that the universe had rules, even if humans didn't fully understand them. Rituals were followed carefully. Festivals marked the passing of time. Sacred days broke up the year like gentle pauses. The gods, it seemed, were satisfied. Families had roles. Parents taught children what mattered. Children learned what was expected. Elders were respected, at least in public. Everyone knew where they fit, or at least pretended they did. That sense of belonging made life easier to carry. And for most people, life was predictable in the best way. You woke up, you worked, you rested, you repeated. Seasons came and went. Problems appeared and were handled, or at least delayed. Nothing suggested collapse. Nothing screamed urgency. Even the army, quiet and disciplined, felt more like a symbol than a necessity. Soldiers trained. Weapons were maintained. Gates were guarded. But real danger felt distant. Almost theoretical. The idea of everything falling apart seemed unrealistic. A story from the past. Something that happened to other civilizations, not this one. This one was different. That belief was everywhere. In the way people walked through streets without looking over their shoulders. In the way leaders spoke with certainty. In the way builders constructed monuments meant to outlast memory itself. Stone does that to people. It makes them feel permanent. This civilization had survived long enough to think it always would. That's not arrogance exactly. It's comfort. The kind that grows quietly when things work for a long time. When disasters become stories instead of threats. There were problems, of course. There always are. Small tensions. Unequal wealth. Complaints about leadership. Whispers about change. But nothing felt urgent enough to threaten the whole. Problems felt manageable. Tomorrow's problems. And tomorrow always came. People measured time by growth, by expansion, by improvement. New buildings. New laws. New ideas layered gently on top of old ones. Progress felt slow but steady, like a river that had never failed to reach the sea. Why would it stop now? From the inside, this world felt complete, balanced, strong enough to carry the weight of the future. Children were being born. Crops were being planted. Projects were being planned that would take years, maybe decades. No one starts a decade-long project if they think the end is near. The civilization didn't feel fragile. It felt heavy, solid. Anchored to the earth itself. Even when people disagreed, they disagreed within the system. They trusted the structure enough to argue inside it, not against it. That trust was everything. At its height, this world believed in itself. Not loudly. Not with shouting, but with quiet certainty. The kind that settles into daily life and becomes invisible. The kind that makes people stop asking what if. And so, as night covered the city, there was no fear in its strength. Only comfort. Only routine. Only the calm confidence of a world that believed it had already proven itself. It did not know that height and balance can feel exactly the same as stability. And it did not know that this quiet confidence, this sense of permanence, was about to be tested by a night that did not care how strong the walls were, how old the laws were, or how certain the future felt. Evening had a rhythm all its own, not the noisy, bustling kind you see during the day, but the quiet, careful rhythm of people winding down, finishing their tasks, and preparing for the night. It was a pattern almost invisible to outsiders, but completely natural to those who lived it every day. Children were often the first to notice, not because they were wiser, but because they were smaller and closer to the ground. Their tiny feet padded across floors as parents called them in for the night. Sometimes it took 3 calls, sometimes more. Whining and running were part of the deal. A child stubbornly refusing to come in could hold off an entire family, bedtime for minutes that felt like hours. But eventually, they all complied. They had no choice, or, well, parents had no choice, but to eventually drag them inside. Inside the homes, the night rituals began. Lamps were lit. A small, steady flame cast shadows across walls, painting stories in flickers of light. Some families placed bowls of water near doors, hoping to ward off anything they didn't understand: spirits, illness, bad luck. Others had charms hanging above thresholds, pieces of string, or small carved figures meant to protect the household. People weren't particularly afraid. These were simply ways to show respect, ways to acknowledge the unseen. Stories were told, not the once-upon-a-time kind meant for distraction, but slow, immersive stories. Tales of ancestors, strange journeys, and quiet triumphs. The elders spoke in soft tones, using long pauses to let the images settle in. Children listened with rapt attention, sometimes laughing at clever turns, sometimes shivering at a hint of danger. It was a gentle reminder. The world had dangers, yes, but you could survive them if you respected the order of things. Dinner, for those still eating, was finishing up. Simple meals, most likely, grain, roasted meat, whatever the season allowed. Conversation wandered from day-to-day matters to small philosophical musings. Did the stars look different tonight? Did the river seem lower than yesterday? Was the wind unusually cool? These questions were never urgent. They were for noticing, for appreciating. Animals too had their own rhythm. Dogs curled near fires. Cats prowled shadows until called in. Birds disappeared quietly into trees. Insects started their nightly chorus, a constant hum that gave the night a pulse without anyone consciously noticing it. The city itself seemed to breathe, exhaling the warmth of the day and inhaling the cool calm of night. And then there were the spiritual rituals. People went to small shrines or temples if they could. They offered thanks for food, for safety, for another day without disaster. Priests or guardians might chant quietly, reciting texts older than most could read. Lamps in temples glimmered like distant stars, and smoke from incense curled upward in gentle, hypnotic spirals. The purpose wasn't always to call for divine intervention. Often, it was to acknowledge continuity, to mark the passage from one day to the next, and to reassure the people that the universe still had order. Night was also a time for preparation. Water was drawn. Lamps were checked. Doors were locked. Walls were inspected. Guards made their final rounds. Children and adults alike made sure everything was in place. This was less about fear and more about habit, a part of life that connected the past to the present. If you followed the rhythm, the world felt manageable. The night felt safe. There was humor too, hidden in small gestures. A parent tickling a child into finally lying still. A merchant joking about how even ghosts would have to line up to get through the market tomorrow. A friend whispering a playful warning about stepping on a shadow. Small, human touches that reminded everyone. Life wasn't only work and worry. It was laughter, too, even if the day was ending quietly. People believed that night held power. Not dangerous power, exactly, but a kind of authority. The night reminded them that they were part of something larger. That time passed whether they noticed or not. That the earth rotated faithfully. That the sun would return. They respected that rhythm, and in return it allowed them to rest. The quietest nights were often the most profound. You could hear yourself think, hear your own heartbeat, hear the city breathing in a way that almost felt like a living entity. Some nights, people claimed they could feel the past brushing against the present. Perhaps they meant the ancestors. Perhaps just the memory of thousands of nights lived exactly the same way. Either way, the feeling was calming. And tonight, on the eve of the end, the calm was complete. Even as children finally drifted to sleep, as families finished their meals and tidied their homes, as streets emptied and shadows stretched long across the walls, the city seemed to hum in contentment. This was life at its most ordinary, and ordinary was powerful. Ordinary meant continuity. Ordinary meant stability. Ordinary, as it turned out, was the most comforting thing in a world that had no idea how soon it would change. By the time the moon rose high, casting silver across the rooftops, the entire city was quiet. Only faint sounds remained. The distant splash of water against the harbor, the whisper of wind through empty streets, the occasional lowing of animals tucked into pens. Every flame flickered just enough to remind you it was alive, but not enough to disturb the perfect darkness. In this way, the night seemed eternal. A soft, protective blanket. A pause in time. A lullaby sung, not just to children, but to the entire civilization. And the people accepted it without question, trusting the rhythm, trusting each other, trusting the unseen, and trusting that tomorrow would follow today. Little did they know, this routine, the careful dance of lamps, doors, prayers, stories, and laughter, was about to become the last of its kind. That the patterns they relied on, the very heartbeat of their civilization, were fragile in ways they could not imagine. That the comfort of night, of routine, of ritual, would soon face a challenge so immense it could not be soothed with a story or a prayer. But for now, it was just another night. Quiet, predictable, safe, filled with tiny jokes, gentle laughter, and small lights flickering against the dark. It was ordinary life, and it was beautiful. And tonight, as with every other night, the people slept, trusting the world would hold them. Night had settled fully over the city now, not with a bang or a shout, but like a soft hand, gently covering everything. It was the kind of silence people felt in their bones, the familiar kind that didn't scare you most of the time. The streets were empty, the markets closed, the animals asleep. Even the occasional creak of a door or the distant bark of a dog felt like part of a rhythm, part of the comforting background hum of life winding down. This silence was not sudden. It had been coming all evening, gradually, like the slow fading of music after a concert ends. First, the shouts of merchants and the chatter of children began to die down. Then the clatter of carts and horses on stone streets softened. Soon, the only sound was the occasional whisper of wind through narrow alleys, carrying hints of smoke, cooked grain, and fresh earth. And for most people, that was exactly the sound they wanted to hear. Silence, in this world, was a friend. It meant nothing was wrong, at least nothing urgent. It was a sign that the day had ended successfully, that the work had been done, the meals eaten, the chores completed. There was humor too, hidden in small gestures. A parent tickling a child into finally lying still. A merchant joking about how even ghosts would have to line up to get through the market tomorrow. A friend whispering a playful warning about stepping on a shadow. Small, human touches that reminded everyone, life wasn't only work and worry. It was laughter, too. Even if the day was ending quietly, people believed that night held power. Not dangerous power, exactly, but a kind of authority. The night reminded them that they were part of something larger, that time passed whether they noticed or not, that the earth rotated faithfully, that the sun would return. They respected that rhythm, and in return it allowed them to rest. The quietest nights were often the most profound. You could hear yourself think, hear your own heartbeat, hear the city breathing in a way that almost felt like a living entity. Some nights, people claimed they could feel the past brushing against the present. Perhaps they meant the ancestors. Perhaps just the memory of thousands of nights lived exactly the same way. Either way, the feeling was calming. And tonight, on the eve of the end, the calm was complete. Even as children finally drifted to sleep, as families finished their meals and tidied their homes, as streets emptied and shadows stretched long across the walls, the city seemed to hum in contentment. This was life at its most ordinary. And ordinary was powerful. Ordinary meant continuity. Ordinary meant stability. Ordinary, as it turned out, was the most comforting thing in a world that had no idea how soon it would change. By the time the moon rose high, casting silver across the rooftops, the entire city was quiet. Only faint sounds remained. The distant splash of water against the harbor, the whisper of wind through empty streets, the occasional lowing of animals tucked into pens. Every flame flickered just enough to remind you it was alive, but not enough to disturb the perfect darkness. In this way, the night seemed eternal. A soft, protective blanket, a pause in time, a lullaby sung not just to children, but to the entire civilization. And the people accepted it without question, trusting the rhythm, trusting each other, trusting the unseen, and trusting that tomorrow would follow today. Little did they know, this routine, the careful dance of lamps, doors, prayers, stories, and laughter, was about to become the last of its kind. that the patterns they relied on, the very heartbeat of their civilization, were fragile in ways they could not imagine, that the comfort of night, of routine, of ritual, would soon face a challenge so immense it could not be soothed with a story or a prayer. But for now, it was just another night. Quiet, predictable, safe, filled with tiny jokes, gentle laughter, and small lights flickering against the dark. It was ordinary life, and it was beautiful. And tonight, as with every other night, the people slept, trusting the world would hold them. Night had settled fully over the city now, not with a bang or a shout, but like a soft hand, gently covering everything. It was the kind of silence people felt in their bones, the familiar kind that didn't scare you most of the time. The streets were empty, the markets closed, the animals asleep. Even the occasional creak of a door or the distant bark of a dog felt like part of a rhythm, part of the comforting background hum of life winding down. This silence was not sudden. It had been coming all evening, gradually, like the slow fading of music after a concert ends. First, the shouts of merchants and the chatter of children began to die down. Then the clatter of carts and horses on stone streets softened. Soon, the only sound was the occasional whisper of wind through narrow alleys, carrying hints of smoke, cooked grain, and fresh earth. And for most people, that was exactly the sound they wanted to hear. Silence, in this world, was a friend. It meant nothing was wrong, at least nothing urgent. It was a sign that the day had ended successfully, that the work had been done, the meals eaten, the chores completed. It allowed people to pause and breathe, to reflect, and sometimes, if you were lucky, to daydream without anyone noticing. Families felt it as they sat together, sharing their evening stories or finishing their meals. The quiet made words more precious, conversations slower. You didn't rush when there was silence to fill. You lingered over sentences, paused for laughter, whispered jokes, and watched shadows dance on walls. It was in these moments that the ordinary felt like magic. A rest rocked gently, ropes creaking just enough to remind you they existed, but not enough to break the peacefulness. Somewhere downstream, the faint call of a night bird added a note to the natural orchestra. People in the city were attuned to this kind of quiet. They trusted it. It told them the world was as it should be. The stars above, the soft glow of lamps below, the occasional wind stirring leaves, all of it formed a gentle reassurance that the day had ended correctly and that the night would keep them safe. They did not question it. They rarely did. Life had a pattern, and the pattern included silence. And yet, even the most familiar silence carries a hint of mystery, the kind that makes you pause and notice the little things. The distant shimmer of water, the rustle of an animal in the shadows, the way a lamp flickers against a wall. People might smile, thinking about small events from the day or the soft joke someone told at dinner. Sometimes they might even chuckle quietly to themselves, alone in the dark, because silence invites little thoughts to surface, little observations, little realizations, little amusements that wouldn't stand out during the chaos of the day. Families continued their bedtime rituals without urgency. Children slept, parents whispered to each other softly, pets settled, fires smoldered. These were the little markers of life, the things that made a night feel lived in, even if no one could put words to why it mattered so much. The night, in its calmness, gave everyone permission to relax. The familiar quiet, combined with the gentle routines, allowed minds to drift. Stories could grow in imagination. Thoughts wandered from one memory to another. Sleep approached naturally, softly, without coercion or fear. Laughter and whispers faded. Even the occasional creak of the city seemed part of the lullaby. By the time the moon had reached its highest point, the entire civilization was wrapped in this quiet. The night was complete. Streets were empty. Lamps glowed softly from behind walls. Winds whispered gently. Even the air itself seemed to pause, as if holding its breath alongside the people it protected. And in that quiet, familiar night, the city rested. Calm, whole, unaware that this comfort, this silence, was about to be challenged in ways no one could have predicted. The ordinary night, which felt eternal and reliable, would soon be tested. But for now, in this moment, there was only peace. Only the comforting rhythm of a city breathing in the dark, the gentle hum of life winding down, and the quiet that made ordinary things like a laugh, a creak, a soft whisper feel extraordinary. This night felt eternal. It felt safe. It felt familiar, and for those who lived it, that was enough. Even the quietest nights have little hints hiding in plain sight. Tiny details that people rarely stop to notice. Things that don't shout, don't bang, don't demand attention. The kind of signs you only see if you slow down enough, and most people never do. That evening, life seemed normal. Even the water behaved oddly. In the harbor, small waves lapped against the hulls of resting ships, almost like they were hesitating. The river meandering through the city carried more debris than usual, leaves, twigs, and little sticks bobbing together in strange patterns. Fishermen who'd worked these waters for decades might have paused and frowned, but the night was quiet, and they were already inside, finishing dinner or washing their hands. Nothing seemed urgent. Nothing seemed wrong. People were busy with the usual routines. Distracted. Children, now asleep, occasionally stirred, murmuring in dreams. Parents adjusted blankets without noticing anything unusual. Merchants checked locks for the night, careful but unaware of the creeping signs around them. The patterns of daily life were so familiar that small anomalies went unnoticed, absorbed into habit. And yet, the signs were there. Little cracks forming in walls that had stood for decades, barely visible in the dim light. A candle sputtering unexpectedly, though it was on fresh oil. A soft, strange smell carried by the wind. Nothing that seemed dangerous. Just different. Even in the city's heartbeat, the guards, the signs whispered faintly. A patrolman noticed his spear felt heavier than usual, but shrugged it off. Another felt the earth beneath his boots tremble slightly, like a tiny drumbeat under the stones. They told each other it was nerves or fatigue. Nobody stopped to think it might be the prelude to something larger. Rumors, too, existed, but they were soft and dismissed. A whisper about an unusual storm, far away. A tale of crops failing in a distant village. A fleeting story about a traveler who had seen something strange on the road. By the time these whispers reached anyone who might worry, they were already shrugged off. Superstition. A story to tell over dinner. Nothing more. Even the moon seemed to act a little differently. Not dramatically. No red moons, no omens, but the silver light didn't feel quite right. It was brighter in some places, duller in others. Shadows stretched at odd angles, as if the world itself was shifting imperceptibly. People admired the moon as they always did, thinking it beautiful, perhaps mysterious, but not threatening. Nothing about it screamed danger. And that was the point. Danger rarely announces itself politely. It waits quietly, often hiding in details so small that ordinary life ignores them. Even nature played its subtle tricks. The night insects chirped a bit differently, some faster, some slower. The smell of the river carried an odd tang. A soft fog began forming over low-lying areas, thin enough to see through, but enough to blur shapes and make the familiar streets feel just a little strange. Humans are excellent at dismissing the things that matter most. And yet, there was something poignant about these conversations, not because of anything happening in the moment. They were nothing extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. And ordinary conversations are easily overlooked, even by those who lived them. The jokes, the small complaints, the shared stories, all these would vanish if the world shifted beneath them. They seemed eternal because they were habitual, because they repeated daily, but repetition does not guarantee continuity. A scholar in a small study, quill in hand, read aloud a passage to a student, explaining a historical event with mild commentary. And so, they built the aqueduct to last 100 years, the scholar said. Or at least, we hope it lasts that long. The student laughed at the idea of structures failing so soon. The room was filled with warmth, the sound of paper turning, the soft scratch of ink on parchment. Outside, the city slept, completely unaware of the larger forces moving in distant lands. Even the guards, walking their rounds along walls and gates, shared small remarks. "The wind seems calm tonight," one said. "Too calm," replied another with a wink, though he didn't mean anything. They joked about each other's slow pace or how a fellow guard always forgot his boots. These were the little moments that made long hours bearable, the small conversations that turned duty into companionship. And in taverns that had stayed open just a little longer, travelers swapped stories, some about adventures along trade routes, others about simple mistakes that led to humorous consequences. The laughter was quiet but genuine, the wine was gentle and smooth, and no one noticed the subtle tension in the wind beyond the city, the slow gathering of storms, the restless currents beyond the horizon. What made these ordinary conversations remarkable, though no one realized it at the time, was that they were entirely unaware of their own fragility. The world outside continued to move, slowly, inexorably. Forces that no single person could see or control were aligning in ways that would soon make ordinary life impossible. And yet, the city and its inhabitants continued to talk, to joke, to whisper, completely unaware. This is often how civilizations end, not with a sudden scream, but while people are immersed in the smallest, most ordinary moments. A dropped word, a whispered complaint, a laugh in the dark, all seemingly inconsequential. And yet, these are the moments that mark the before of history, the moments that no one will ever quite forget in stories retold, even if details fade. Even in the quiet of the night, some conversations lingered longer than others. A parent whispering reassurance to a child, a scholar debating a point with a student, a pair of friends teasing each other over a minor disagreement. In hindsight, these were the last ordinary conversations the city would ever have. Every word, every laugh, every gentle argument would soon be overlaid by events too large to comprehend, too powerful to ignore. But for now, they were ordinary. They were comforting. They were enough. And that was precisely why the city trusted the night so completely. In these final hours of ordinary life, every small conversation reinforced the illusion of stability. Every whisper and laugh was a lullaby, a promise that life would continue as it always had. And so, the city slept, accompanied by its ordinary conversations. The world outside moved quietly, beyond sight. The forces gathering beyond the horizon continued their patient work. And inside, humans spoke softly to one another, sharing moments that seemed eternal but were about to become history. Tonight, life was ordinary, and perfect in its simplicity. Ordinary, and tragically unprepared for what was coming. By the time midnight arrived, the city had fully surrendered to the quiet of the night. The streets were empty, lamps flickered softly, and a gentle hush lay over the rooftops, like the world was holding its breath. It was the kind of stillness that made every sound feel amplified. The whisper of wind through a narrow alley, the soft creak of a door, the faint ripple of water in the harbor. From above, the city looked like a delicate pattern of light and shadow. Lamps glowed in scattered homes, their golden warmth softening the cold edges of stone walls. Smoke spiraled lazily from chimneys, mixing with the pale silver of moonlight. Even the river, reflecting the sky, seemed subdued, its gentle currents almost meditative. It was a sight that could make you pause, take a deep breath, and feel just for a moment that the world was safe. Inside homes, the midnight hour carried its own quiet rituals. Some sleepers turned in their beds, murmuring in dreams. Others lay perfectly still, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of rest. The fires in hearths smoldered low, casting flickering shadows on walls. Lamps were occasionally refilled, doors double-checked, blankets adjusted. The night, calm as it was, demanded attentiveness in small, almost unnoticed ways. The guards, still awake, patrolled with steady steps. Midnight stretched out like a long road beneath their feet, the city's silence making their watch feel heavier than usual. They exchanged quiet words, joking softly about their slow pace, or teasing one another about who always forgot a detail. Humor, as always, softened the weight of duty, and yet there was a subtle awareness among them, a sense that the night held more than just calm. They couldn't see it, of course, nobody could, but instinct whispered, as instincts often do, that nothing stays exactly the same forever. Even the natural world participated in this quiet ritual. Owls hooted softly from trees, their voices echoing across empty streets. Insects added faint rhythm to the hum of the night. The wind, brushing against rooftops, moved like a gentle hand, steady and predictable. And somewhere far off, animals stirred, responding to cues humans couldn't see. It was all ordinary, but it was also alive, reminding the city that the world had its own plans, beyond the control of any one person. In the heart of the city, a scholar sat awake by candlelight, quietly noting observations from earlier that day. Small details, almost trivial, but recorded nonetheless. The pattern of the stars, the shape of clouds, a slight tremor felt while walking the streets. Nothing alarming, just unusual. The scholar made a note, then set the pen down, confident these were minor anomalies. It was midnight, the world was calm, and life, they believed, would continue exactly as it had for centuries. The moon traced its path across the sky, bathing streets and rooftops in soft silver light. Shadows shifted slowly, stretching and shrinking as if breathing. For anyone awake, it was hypnotic, almost meditative. Time felt elastic. The midnight hour, especially on a calm night like this, could make a person feel suspended, caught between yesterday and tomorrow, between past and future. It was a perfect moment for reflection, or for stories whispered softly in the dark. Families slept, but sometimes whispers slipped through doors. A child murmuring a dream, a parent adjusting a blanket, a pet nudging someone awake with a soft nudge. These small interruptions reminded the city that life continued quietly, steadily, even in sleep. And the city accepted it, trusting that these soft rhythms, these ordinary movements, were enough to keep the world safe. There was also humor, hidden in subtle ways. A cat knocking over a bowl, only to stare at it indignantly, as if it was someone else's fault. A guard stumbling over a loose stone and quietly cursing under his breath. Even these tiny, human moments were part of the rhythm of the night. Little reminders that life, even in its calmest moments, carried imperfections. And imperfection, as it often does, makes life feel real. Midnight over the city was deceptive. It felt eternal, unchanging, complete. It lured people into comfort, into trust, into a sense of safety. The world seemed predictable, stable, frozen in a perfect moment between one day and the next. And in some ways, it was exactly that. Yet the very calm that made the city feel safe also hid what was coming. Forces beyond the horizon, subtle and patient, continued their slow work. The wind carried faint shifts in weather. Animals moved differently in distant lands. Rivers changed course slightly, unseen. And somewhere, decisions made far away, in places the city would never see, began threading their influence toward this quiet world. The people in the city did not notice. Why would they? There was nothing urgent, nothing to shout about. The moon smiled gently from above. The rivers shimmered softly, and the lamps flickered without urgency. The ordinary rhythm of midnight reassured them. And reassurance is powerful. It can make even the subtlest signs of change invisible. Still, in the depth of night, there was a tension only perceptible to the careful observer. Not panic, not fear, just a whisper, a suggestion that the world was not entirely under human control. It might be a tremor in the ground, a flicker in a lamp, a restless animal, something so small it could easily be dismissed. But in hindsight, these tiny threads would be seen as the first stirrings of a night that would change everything. And yet, the city slept on. Families, guards, scholars, merchants have, in their routines, everyone immersed in ordinary life. The night held them gently, wrapped them in calm, and lulled them into a belief that tomorrow would arrive as always. It was a lullaby the entire civilization shared together. Midnight, in all its calm and familiarity, stretched endlessly. And in that stretch of time, everything felt eternal, safe, predictable, whole, and the city, in all its ordinary, quiet perfection, had no idea that the very world it trusted, the night, the moon, the silence, was about to witness forces that would soon challenge every assumption. But for now, at the stroke of midnight, nothing had changed, and that, for the moment, was enough. The night had been calm for hours, almost hypnotically so. Every street, every home, every lamp seemed perfectly aligned with the rhythm of the city. But, as it often happens, the first cracks in a quiet night don't arrive with shouts or alarms. They arrive softly, almost politely, so subtle that most people dismiss them entirely. It began with a sound, not a loud one, nothing dramatic, just a faint vibration beneath the stone streets. A tremor, really, so slight that it might have been mistaken for a cart rumbling somewhere distant. A few sleepers stirred, murmuring in their sleep, but the city, as a whole, remained still. People trusted the familiar, and the familiar didn't shake. Elsewhere, a lamp flickered more than usual, its flame winking against the wall. In a small kitchen, a mother adjusted the flame, muttering softly about the oil being cheap lately. Outside, the wind shifted just a little, nudging shutters against their frames. And in the harbor, one ship's rope groaned slightly against the mast, as if complaining about the quiet. All tiny things, all easily ignored. Even the animals seemed aware of the first subtle disturbance. Cats prowled more carefully along walls, tails twitching. Dogs lifted their heads from slumber, ears pricked to the night air. Birds shifted in nests, letting out a note or two before settling again. No one would have noticed except that instinct sometimes senses things before reason does. And instinct does not speak in words. It whispers in small movements. In the city, a scholar sat at a window, quill in hand, noting details of the stars and the moon. He paused when the air seemed different, cooler than before, with a strange tang, like iron or rain yet to fall. He frowned briefly, then shook his head, and returned to his work. Nothing in the city demanded attention. Nothing had yet changed. In homes, ordinary conversations continued. A parent murmured instructions to a child. A friend joked with a sibling about spilling a meal earlier. Laughter floated softly through rooms. Even as the tremor passed unnoticed and the lamp flickered again, life seemed unchanged. The city had been through odd nights before, strange winds, minor quakes, faint smells of storm, and survived them all. Why worry now? But it wasn't just one tiny anomaly. Elsewhere, distant clouds carried a muted rumble of thunder. Far-off rivers shifted unexpectedly, carrying unfamiliar debris downstream. Small fires flickered in the distance, unseen but present, leaving only a faint trace of smoke in the night air. Every small disturbance was isolated, meaningless on its own. Together, however, they were threads of change, slowly knitting themselves into a pattern that would soon reach the city. Still, the people slept on, comforted by routine. Guards continued their rounds, unaware that the tremor beneath their feet was real. Merchants rested in locked homes. Children dreamed of mundane adventures. And the city, confident in its walls, its lamps, its quiet, remained oblivious. Even humor persisted in these early moments of change. A cat startled by a flickering flame darted across a room, sending a pot clattering, but no one was injured. A guard stumbled over a loose stone in an alley, muttering softly and laughing at himself. Ordinary life continued, masking the first cracks in the calm. The subtle break in silence, however, was important. It reminded the world that nothing, not even the quietest, most familiar nights, is ever permanent. A single tremor, a single flicker of a lamp, a single unusual sound is enough to hint at what is to come. But human nature is to ignore it. Most dismiss the small signs, trusting the familiar instead of questioning it. And this is how civilizations, even at their peak, can fail to notice their own vulnerability. Time passed slowly, the tremor faded, the lamp stabilized, and the night returned to seeming perfection. People slept again, undisturbed, yet the first break in the silence had already happened. The city, confident and secure, would not yet understand that the ordinary night it trusted had begun to change. By the moonlight, the streets still appeared calm. Fires in hearths smoldered gently. Lamps glowed softly. Shadows danced on walls. And yet, the city had crossed the threshold. The first subtle disturbances were no longer hypothetical. They had arrived. They had brushed against daily life, barely noticed, and moved on. Like tiny footsteps on the edge of consciousness, they had left a mark invisible to all but the patient observer. And while the city remained unaware, the world beyond the walls continued to shift. Winds, rivers, and distant storms moved steadily, patiently. The tremors and flickers within the city were mere echoes of what lay beyond. In the hours to come, these small signs would become impossible to ignore. Tonight, though, they were easy to dismiss, easy to laugh off, easy to ignore. So the city slept, as it always did, comforted by its lamps, fires, and routines. And in that comfort, it trusted that the night would hold, that silence would persist, and that tomorrow would arrive as usual. It did not yet know that the first crack had appeared, that ordinary life was beginning to wobble, that history, quietly, was preparing to rewrite itself. And that is often how endings begin. Softly, subtly, almost politely, with whispers, not shouts, with flickers, not flames, with tiny tremors, not earthquakes. By the time the city realized, the ordinary night it loved would be gone forever. But for now, nothing had yet changed. Only the faintest hint had passed through, like a sigh across the rooftops, barely noticed and already forgotten. The night had been calm for hours, almost perfectly so. But now, the first hints of unease began to ripple through the city. Unlike the subtle tremors of Chapter 9, this was different, more persistent, more noticeable, though still gentle enough that most people barely registered it. Yet it was the night's first real protest against the ordinary, against the comfortable rhythm the city had trusted for centuries. It started with small things. A lamplight flickered again, this time more insistently. A guard on the outer wall glanced up, noticing the shadows stretched unnaturally across the stones, though he said nothing. The wind shifted with a deliberate stiffness, tugging at doors, rattling shutters. Dogs barked briefly at nothing, and then went silent. Even the moonlight felt a touch colder, washing the streets in an unfamiliar silver that made walls seem higher, rooftops steeper, alleys longer. Inside homes, families stirred. A child woke briefly, muttering in sleep. A parent whispered, "It's nothing," even though the sound in the streets had startled them. Some sat upright, listening. The air seemed different, not dangerous, exactly, but charged with a subtle tension, like the moment before a door creaks open unexpectedly. People, comforted by habit, dismissed it. Habit is a powerful shield. The market district, now empty, seemed to hum with anticipation, not loud or violent, just a sense that movement was possible, that the familiar night rhythm might shift at any second. Loose shutters rattled. A stray cat hissed at an invisible presence and retreated into shadow. The occasional clatter of a tin pot from an unattended stall made the silence feel heavier, like the world was pausing, waiting for a response. Even the harbor felt slightly off. Ships that had been rocking gently now tilted just a little more, ropes whining softly against the wood. Water lapped with a faint irregularity, almost as if it had a pulse. Sailors who had retired early might have noticed, but the harbor was quiet and their beds were warmer than curiosity. Nature was nudging the city awake, but the city refused to rise. In the scholarly quarters, a teacher paused mid-lesson, quill hovering over parchment. The shadows cast by the candlelight trembled ever so slightly. "Strange wind," he muttered to a student. The student laughed lightly, dismissing the comment as superstition. The old pattern of knowledge was strong. Focus on the known, ignore the faint hints of the unknown. And so, life continued. But outside, the forces were not waiting politely anymore. The gentle stirrings beyond the horizon were growing bolder. Clouds moved faster, brushing over the city like slow-moving fingers. The faint rumble of distant thunder, previously ignoble, grew into a soft percussion, a heartbeat under the still streets. Trees swayed with a stiffness that suggested more than wind. Animals acted nervously, sensing change before humans could name it. Even ordinary conversations began to shift. A parent whispered a warning about a small sound outside. A friend paused mid-laugh, listening. The city, usually full of chatter in hidden pockets, fell into quiet observation. People were noticing that the night was not quite like before. Yet no one could yet name the cause. And because no one could, most ignored the feeling, trusting in walls, lamps, and habit. Humor persisted in tiny ways. A guard tripped over a stone, muttering curses with a half-grin. A cat leapt from one rooftop to another, landing with a dramatic flourish. These small bursts of life were comforting, even as the subtle tension grew. Humans rely on humor to hold the edges of uncertainty, to feel in control when control is slipping. By now, the city itself seemed to breathe differently. Shadows moved in ways that felt almost intentional. Lamps flickered in rhythm with the wind. The distant river sounded slightly louder than normal. The ordinary quiet had been broken. Not violently, not catastrophically, but enough to prick the sense of security every citizen had taken for granted. This was the first time in centuries that the night seemed aware. The ordinary had been challenged, and though most of the city remained asleep or distracted, the tiniest observers, the animals, a few guards, a lone scholar felt the shift. They couldn't yet articulate it, couldn't yet respond. All they could do was notice that the night had grown subtly heavier, as if it were gathering its own strength. And in that subtle heaviness lay the truth. The calm the city had relied on for generations was fragile. The rhythm that had lulled thousands to sleep was no longer entirely theirs to trust. Outside forces, the wind, the river, distant storms, the movement of unseen humans, the subtle rhythm of nature itself were asserting themselves quietly but insistently. Ordinary life was still happening. Children slept, parents whispered, lamps glowed, fires smoldered. Conversations continued, small and familiar, like a soft melody in a theater where something extraordinary is about to happen offstage. The difference was that the melody now had an unexpected note, a tension underneath that made it impossible to ignore entirely. This was the moment when the night first turned against the city. Not with fire or chaos, not with immediate destruction, but with a subtle insistence that the ordinary might not last. That calm was temporary, that walls, lamps, routines, and habits, all the things the civilization had trusted, could not contain the movement of the larger world forever. And so, the city slept on, wrapped in warmth, comfort, and habit, unaware that the night had begun to assert its own will, softly, gently, like a tide slowly pushing against a dock. Tonight, ordinary life had been challenged for the first time, and the city, for all its strength and confidence, was not prepared. But still, the streets were quiet. Lamps flickered, fires glowed, shadows stretched, and for now, the world held its breath alongside the city, waiting to see if the ordinary would hold, or if the forces beyond. By now, the night was no longer entirely calm. The city, though still mostly asleep, carried a subtle unease in the air, a faint tension that clung to rooftops, walls, and streets. It wasn't loud, it didn't scream, but for those who were awake, it was impossible to ignore. Whispers began to spread, small, almost secretive signals that something was different tonight. It started quietly. A guard, walking his late-night rounds along the northern wall, paused mid-step. The wind had shifted again, carrying a faint scent, damp, earthy, like rain on distant hills, and a whisper of sound that didn't belong. Maybe it was a loose tile clattering in the breeze. Maybe it was something else. The guard shook his head, muttering to himself, nothing to worry about. And yet, instinct prickled at the back of his neck. Elsewhere, a scholar reading by candlelight noticed his lamp flicker in a pattern that seemed deliberate. He frowned and glanced toward the window. The shadows from the flame stretched differently, almost like fingers pointing toward the horizon. He dismissed it as imagination, but a faint worry lingered in his mind, a worry that refused to go away entirely. Even ordinary citizens began to murmur softly. A parent whispered to a child about a strange sound outside. A merchant, peeking from a second-story window, remarked to a neighbor, "Did you hear that?" But when neighbors listened, they heard nothing, just the soft hum of wind through empty streets. No one took it seriously. Why would they? Nights had strange noises sometimes. Shadows moved. Doors creaked. It was normal, ordinary. Safe. Animals were perhaps the first to truly notice. Dogs barked softly at invisible presences. Cats prowled along walls and rooftops, ears twitching toward distant movement. Even the night birds stirred, letting out occasional, weary cries. People attributed the noises to ordinary causes: hunger, the wind, the restlessness of nocturnal creatures. Few considered that animals often perceive things humans cannot. But the whispers continued. They were quiet, polite even, slipping from one attentive ear to another. "Something is different tonight," said a watchman softly to a colleague. "Perhaps it's nothing," replied the other. But even as he spoke, he felt the unease pressing against him. The ordinary night seemed to stretch thinner, more fragile than it had any right to feel. In small homes, families whispered to each other. "Did you hear that?" one parent asked. "It's probably just the wind," another replied. Children listened in half-sleep, eyes wide, not fully understanding but feeling the shift in tone. Even in ordinary conversations, there was now a note of caution, a subtle tension threading itself through routines that had always been predictable. In the market district, empty now but for the occasional stray animal or watchman, shadows stretched oddly across stalls. A cat hissed from atop a crate. A loose jar rattled. A faint whisper of movement traveled down alleys. A solitary merchant, checking the locks, paused. "Strange," he muttered. "Too quiet, and yet not quiet enough." The words were almost lost to the wind, swallowed by the night, but they marked the first acknowledgement among humans that the ordinary night was shifting. Even the moon seemed aware. Its silver light glinted sharply off tiles and stones, more reflective than usual, highlighting the subtle movements of the city. Lamps and hearths appeared dimmer by comparison, casting smaller, uncertain shadows. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if preparing for something just beyond sight. And while these whispers spread quietly, almost like the soft flutter of wings, the city's sleep remained unbroken for the most part. Most people ignored the subtle warnings, trusting the ordinary, trusting the familiar. Habit, after all, is a strong shield. People dismissed the tension, laughing softly at themselves for feeling nervous, reassuring each other that the night was safe. Yet, instinct lingered where reason failed. A guard's hand lingered on his spear. A parent's gaze strayed to the shadows beyond the window. A scholar's quill hovered in midair. Something about the night had changed, and even if they could not name it, they sensed it. These whispered warnings, gentle and polite, were the last moments in which the city could have paused, truly observed, and acknowledged the approaching disruption. The ordinary rhythms, lamps, fires, conversations, routines were still intact, still comforting. But for the first time, the illusion of complete control wavered, and the world beyond the walls, beyond the city, continued its patient work. Clouds gathered, rivers shifted, winds carried distant storm whispers, and unseen forces pressed slowly forward. All of it moved like a tide against the stillness of the city, imperceptible to all but the keenest observers. By the end of this hour, the whispers would fade into sleep for most people, but the city's unconscious mind, tuned to survival over centuries, registered them. These were small signals, almost polite nudges, suggesting that the night might not be as ordinary as it seemed. And though ignored, they were enough to mark a turning point. Tonight, the city was still calm, still ordinary on the surface. But the first human acknowledgement of change, the whispered warnings in the dark, had begun. And once a city notices even the softest hint that the night is no longer entirely safe, there is no going back. For now, the night still held them, gentle but deliberate. But the ordinary, as it always does before an ending, had begun to fracture. The whispers in the dark had faded for most, swallowed by sleep and habit. Yet the night itself seemed restless now, as if aware that the ordinary order was being tested. The calm of earlier hours no longer held. There was a subtle shift in the air, a tension that humans, though often slow to notice, could no longer entirely ignore. It started with the wind. Gentle at first, as it had been all night, it began to gather a little weight, moving more insistently through alleys and streets. It tugged at shutters, rattled loose tiles, and carried scents the city hadn't smelled for weeks. Earth, damp leaves, distant rain. People inside their homes felt the shift vaguely. A parent glanced toward the window, adjusting a blanket over a child who had stirred. A merchant muttered to himself, "Too much wind tonight," and went back to checking the locks. None truly realized that this was the harbinger of a much larger change. The river, once a mirror of the moonlight, began to move differently too. Its surface rippled with a new restlessness, carrying floating debris that had not been there before. Sticks, leaves, even small scraps of distant vegetation. The boats at the harbor swayed gently, their ropes whining against the masts. Sailors who had retired early were unaware of the subtle warning, but instinctive animals nearby, the cats, the dogs, the birds, stirred nervously. Clouds began to gather in the distance, a slow, almost polite advance at first. They didn't roll violently across the sky, no thunder yet, no bright flashes of lightning. Instead, they crept, stretching long shadows across the horizon, dimming the moonlight just enough to make the streets look unfamiliar. Observant watchers noticed them, of course. Guards on the walls squinted skyward. A scholar paused mid-note, tilting his head. But for the most part, the city carried on, lulled by the familiarity of its own streets and homes. Even animals acted as if aware of the approaching disturbance. Birds huddled in nests, low in the trees. Dogs lifted their heads from slumber, ears twitching toward the distant hum of wind and water. Cats prowled along walls more cautiously than usual. Small signs, subtle movements, and instincts whispered warnings that humans often ignored. Conversations in homes reflected this subtle change. Parents whispered more cautiously. Children woke, half asleep, murmuring about dreams they could barely remember. Friends, speaking softly in the courtyard, paused occasionally, glancing at shadows that now seemed slightly longer, slightly stranger. Laughter persisted, yes, but carried a hint of nervousness, a subtle tension threading itself through ordinary interactions. Even humor became tempered, careful, as if instinctively acknowledging the world outside was no longer entirely predictable. In the market district, empty, but for the occasional cat or stray dog, shadows moved differently. Loose jars rattled, wind whistled through the streets, and the occasional tin sign swayed with an unfamiliar insistence. The city, still believing in the ordinary, barely noticed. Those few who did paused, considered mentioning it, but shrugged it off. Nights were unpredictable sometimes, they told themselves. Habit is a powerful comfort. And yet, the city was beginning to change. The first tremors, flickering lamps, and whispered warnings had been subtle. Now, the storm was approaching. Not yet visible, not yet violent, but undeniably present. The night was heavier, charged with anticipation. It carried a sense that something larger, unstoppable, was moving closer with patient determination. The moon, ever watchful, had dimmed slightly behind thin veils of cloud. Its silver light no longer bathed the city in uniform calm. Instead, shadows stretched across rooftops, twisted in ways that made alleys look longer, stairs steeper. Even the familiar paths felt strange to those who wandered. People remained mostly unaware, lulled by routine and comfort. But the change was perceptible to the careful observer. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath. Trees swayed cautiously. The river's murmur grew louder, a soft, constant reminder that the world beyond the city was never truly still. Animals, from the smallest insects to the largest dogs, moved as if sensing the pattern of the storm yet to arrive. The ordinary rhythms of the city fires, lamps, guards, patrols, conversations continued, but they were now framed by a tension that had no words. And so the city lingered in that delicate balance, caught between the familiar and the impending. The storm had not yet arrived in full force. There was no panic, no catastrophe, only subtle shifts, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. A soft reminder that ordinary life, no matter how comforting, can never completely control the forces that lie beyond walls, streets, and human understanding. Tonight, the storm approached quietly, politely even, gathering strength beyond the horizon. The city slept, unaware of how fragile its calm had become. Tomorrow, when the storm fully arrived, the ordinary rhythms of life would be challenged. But for now, the city rested in a deceptive comfort, lulled by habit, warmth, and routine. And in that deceptive calm, the world waited, patient, inexorable, unstoppably, to shift the ordinary into history. The first raindrops arrived like a soft whisper, almost hesitant, as if the sky itself wasn't sure it wanted to disturb the city's slumber. They fell slowly at first, tapping gently on rooftops, cobblestones, and the occasional lamplight. The sound was light, rhythmic, calming, even like a lullaby, if anyone had the presence of mind to hear it. Most people didn't. They were asleep, dreaming of ordinary days, unaware that the storm had begun its gentle intrusion. The drops gathered quickly, forming small puddles in alleyways and streets. Their patter blended with the restless wind, creating a soft symphony that seemed both comforting and slightly uncanny. Lamps flickered as raindrops kissed their flames, shadows dancing on walls in uneven patterns. For the few awake, the night no longer felt entirely familiar. The ordinary rhythm had been interrupted in the gentlest way possible, but the interruption carried a subtle tension. Animals noticed immediately. Cats curled tighter into corners or leapt onto higher rooftops, watching the wet streets warily. Dogs stirred, shaking damp fur as they padded silently across courtyards. Birds, still half asleep, adjusted in their nests, their soft calls punctuating the rhythm of falling rain. Every creature responded instinctively, acknowledging the storm before humans fully registered it. A guard on the northern wall leaned against the parapet, his cloak damp from the first drops. He tilted his head to listen, the soft drumming against stone and tiles strangely hypnotic. Rain at this hour, he muttered under his breath. Not common, but not dangerous. Still, the hair on the back of his neck stood slightly on end. The wind whispered through the battlements, carrying a faint chill that hinted at change. Inside homes, families stirred. Parents adjusted blankets over children. Someone murmured about the smell of rain in the air, fresh and earthy, slightly unsettling in the middle of the night. Conversations were sparse, murmured, soft enough not to disturb the fragile calm. Even ordinary remarks, like a parent joking about slipping in puddles, or a child asking if the rain would wake the chickens, felt touched by a faint unease. The streets themselves seemed transformed. Cobblestones glistened under the moonlight, reflecting silver patches of sky. Shadows, once predictable and static, now danced in the wet light, stretching and shrinking with every passing cloud. Alleyways seemed longer, rooftops steeper, and familiar corners slightly alien. The city had not yet experienced the full storm, but the first raindrops had already begun to bend perception subtly. Even the harbor.com earlier began to respond. Water lapped louder against the hulls of resting ships. Ropes creaked and strained in the gentle wind. Sailors, now awakened by the sound, hurried to secure their vessels, though no one yet realized the rain was merely the storm's opening act. The river carried its burden downstream, gathering leaves, twigs, and debris, hinting at the storm's wider reach beyond the city walls. Everywhere, the rain spoke in quiet patterns. It touched rooftops, chimneys, and streets, reminding the city that the world beyond its walls was alive, patient, and capable of subtle intrusion. No one felt alarmed in it yet. The rain was soft, polite, almost soothing. Yet beneath it was a whisper. The ordinary night, the familiar, comforting rhythm of life, was beginning to shift. Even the moon seemed affected. Clouds brushed its face intermittently, dimming its glow, scattering light unevenly across walls and streets. Shadows flickered differently. Lamps struggled against the moisture in the air. And for anyone awake, the city no longer felt entirely secure. The first raindrops had arrived, gentle, almost innocent, but carrying the unmistakable signature of change. In homes, whispers spread as people awoke to the rain. "It's unusual," a parent said quietly to another. "Is it, coming from far away?" The other shrugged. "Probably just a passing shower," they replied, though the uncertainty lingered. Even small doubts, easily dismissed under ordinary circumstances, now had a way of nesting in the mind, quietly eroding the sense of calm. The storm had begun without a roar, without a bang. It had arrived with softness and subtlety, just enough to disturb the city's familiar rhythm. The ordinary was being questioned. The comfortable pattern of streets, roofs, lamps, and harsh the things that made life predictable was being nudged gently, insistently, toward change. And yet, life continued. Families adjusted. Guardias patrolled. Animals reacted. Lamps flickered. Conversations remained soft, even playful, though touched by curiosity or mild concern. Ordinary life persisted, now under the gentle insistence of falling rain. The night, once perfectly still and reassuring, was now alive with sound, movement, and quiet tension. For the city, it was a subtle awakening, a first notice that ordinary nights, no matter how long and comfortable, can be broken. That calm is always temporary, that even the gentlest raindrops can remind a civilization that the world moves on, regardless of habit, comfort, or trust. And as the rain continued to fall softly on the ancient stones, the city held its breath still, unaware of the storm's full power, but feeling, at last, that the night was no longer entirely theirs. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, drumming softly on rooftops, splashing against cobblestones, and filling the city with a quiet, persistent music. The night had changed. The first polite hint of a storm had evolved into something more deliberate. Shadows, which had once hugged walls and corners in familiar shapes, began to grow taller, stretching farther than they should, twisting just slightly as if testing the city's sense of normalcy. In homes, the changes were subtle but perceptible. A lamp flickered unevenly, casting a long, wobbly shadow across a bedroom wall. A parent noticed it and chuckled nervously, blaming the candle wick. A child watched it with wide eyes, imagining shapes moving along the ceiling. No one saw the significance yet. Shadows are always playful, bending, and dancing. But tonight they seemed to hint at something larger, something creeping at the edges of perception. Outside, the streets reflected the tall, twisting silhouettes. Rainwater mirrored lamplight and moonlight, multiplying shadows, stretching them into shapes that didn't exist in daylight. Alleyways appeared narrower or longer, depending on where you stood. A stray cat paused to consider a shadow before slinking along a wall. A dog shook its wet fur, eyes darting at shapes that humans would dismiss as illusions. Even the guards noticed, though they mostly ignored it. One tilted his head at the elongated shadow of a lamppost. "Funny how the light changes tonight," he murmured to his companion. "Just the wind," the other replied. And yet both guards unconsciously adjusted their pace, unconsciously stiffened, feeling that the ordinary rules of the night were bending in small, almost polite ways. In the harbor, shadows shifted across the water, reflecting tall masts and rigging onto rippling surfaces. The boats seemed to tilt slightly differently, as if aware of the shadows that were no longer just reflections. Sailors who ventured out to secure ropes or check the hulls commented quietly to one another, "It's just the rain," or the moonlight. But instinct told them otherwise. Shadows, after all, are subtle truth-tellers. They exaggerate, reveal, and hint at things humans often cannot yet see. Even conversations in homes reflected the growing tension. A parent whispered to a child about the shadows in the hallway. A friend paused mid-joke in the courtyard, glancing toward the dimly lit street. "Did you notice how the lamplight falls differently tonight?" one asked. The other laughed, nervously, but neither could deny the slight unease threading through the familiar city. Something about the ordinary was bending, stretching, growing like the shadows themselves. Nature mirrored these changes. The wind picked up subtly, moving clouds faster across the sky. The rain tapped more insistently, heavier in some places, softer in others. Trees swayed, casting long twisted shadows that stretched over walls and into courtyards. Animals reacted, shifting positions, quieting their noises, as if acknowledging a pattern in the night that humans had yet to understand. Even the moon, once a calm overseer, seemed altered. This was no longer just rain. This was the city feeling the first brush of change, subtle yet undeniable. The storm was shaping not only the weather but the perception of the world itself. For now, the shadows grew taller, and the city, wrapped in rain, light,